They say wild horses never seek out humans, unless something greater than instinct drives them. One quiet autumn afternoon, on the windswept plains of Montana, a Mustang appeared at the edge of an old horse ranch, its eyes holding a strange invitation. A war veteran, freshly returned from the battlefield and his father's funeral, couldn't explain why he followed the horse into the shadowed woods. But he did. At the end of a forgotten trail, buried beneath years of fallen leaves, he found a weathered cabin that time itself had seemingly abandoned. Inside, something waited, a truth long buried, a soul in need of saving, and maybe his own. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. Luke Callahan had spent over a decade in the Marine Corps, deployed to the deserts and mountains of the Middle East. When the orders came granting him an honorable discharge, he felt a swirl of relief and dread. Relief because he could finally leave the relentless grind of combat. Dread because he had no real plan for life back home, only the knowledge that his father was gone. Everett Callahan had died of heart failure 3 months earlier, and Luke hadn't even made it back in time for the funeral. Luke carried that guilt with him as he traveled from one airport to another, eventually arriving in the outskirts of Lone Ridge, Montana, a town perched on the edge of rolling plains and thick pine forests. The Callahan Ranch lay just beyond the main road, framed by tall grasses and a rickety wooden fence that had once been fresh and strong. Now the boards were warped and missing in places, with entire sections fallen to the ground. The wide, open fields where his father's horses had once roamed free were overgrown with weeds as tall as Luke's waist. A few half-starved horses still wandered about, eyeing Luke from a distance when he stepped onto the property. They barely recognized him, just as he barely recognized the ranch he had grown up on. Stepping into the main house, Luke was startled by the chill in the air. The cabin was a simple structure of timber logs, constructed decades ago by his grandfather. The living room was empty now, except for an old rocking chair and a dusty coffee table. The slightest sound echoed in the silence. Luke rested a single duffel bag on the floor, the only luggage he bothered to bring from his years of service. He was used to traveling light, to leaving quickly if needed. But this place, for all its disrepair, was his final anchor. His father had bequeathed it to him without so much as a letter of explanation. The last time Luke had spoken to Everett Callahan was nearly a year ago, and their conversation had been strained. Now his father was gone, leaving behind a legacy that felt more like a haunting. For days, Luke lived in isolation. He rarely ventured into town, opting instead to focus on the ranch. Each morning, he woke at dawn to feed the remaining horses, skittish, underfed creatures that had survived on meager grass and the mercy of intermittent rainfall. Then he cleaned the stables and tried to repair sections of fence. Despite his best efforts, he made slow progress. The ranch was large, and the years of neglect had taken their toll. In the afternoons, he walked the perimeter of the property, boots crunching on dried weeds and small twigs. The silence was profound, occasionally broken by the lonely whinny of a horse or the cry of a hawk overhead. Luke's nights were worse. He slept fitfully on the old sofa in the living room, haunted by memories of his tours in the Middle East, night raids, IED explosions, the loss of friends. Sometimes he dreamed of the father he left behind. In these dreams, Everett stood at the ranch gate, a shadow in the evening light, saying nothing, only gazing at Luke with unreadable eyes. Luke woke each time with a tightness in his chest, unsure if it came from sorrow or something else. He couldn't help recalling that the father he knew was a stern, quiet man. Everett had taught Luke to ride when he was 9, insisted that he learn how to manage the ranch even if he never wanted to. Luke's teenage years had been a constant push and pull with a dad who rarely expressed affection. Yet now, rummaging through leftover documents in the house, Luke realized how much Everett must have cared in his own way. There were veterinary bills carefully filed from years ago, pictures of Luke as a small child galloping on a pony, and old letters from the county extolling Everett's breeding program for champion horses. Luke hadn't known about any of these accomplishments. He had never bothered to ask. One late afternoon in early autumn, when the sky was streaked with pale gold and the air held a faint chill, Luke saddled one of the healthier ranch horses for a ride. He needed to check the fencing along the western boundary, which bordered a patch of dense pine forest. Rumors said wild animals sometimes roamed there. Coyotes, perhaps even a stray wolf. He wanted to ensure nothing was getting onto his land, or if they were, to see how they managed it with the fences so deteriorated. He rode at a slow canter, letting the horse pick its way through the tall grass. The sun cast long shadows across the field, and the silhouette of the pine trees looked like dark sentinels standing guard on the horizon. Approaching the far corner of the ranch, Luke dismounted and inspected a long stretch of broken fence. The wood was rotten and collapsed, lying like fallen matchsticks across the earth. Before he could decide how best to fix it, a movement caught his eye from beyond the fence, near the tree line. There, rising out of the twilight, was the form of a Mustang, a wild horse, free of any saddle or bridle. At first, Luke questioned whether he was seeing things, but as he stared, the creature stepped forward, revealing a rugged coat, tangled mane, and a proud stance. The Mustang's left hind leg favored the ground slightly, hinting at some minor injury, yet the horse's gaze was sharp, focused on Luke. Luke's own horse snorted and shifted uneasily. He rested a calming hand on its neck, but his attention remained locked on the Mustang. For a moment, neither man nor beast moved. The wind rustled the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth. Luke could feel his heart beating with inexplicable force. He had faced life-or-death situations in war zones, but there was something strangely intimate in this silent encounter. The Mustang didn't bolt away. Instead, it stood as if carved from stone, ears pricked forward. Its coat gleamed faintly in the waning sunlight, even with mud clinging to its lower legs. Luke took a single step closer, drawn by an odd mixture of curiosity and awe. A wave of tension vibrated in the air. He had grown up around horses, but this one exuded a presence that unsettled him, like it was testing him, or perhaps beckoning him onward. Luke took a hesitant step past the broken fence, letting his ranch horse remain behind. The moment he moved, the wild Mustang let out a sharp, high-pitched neigh, a warning or a challenge. It was hard to tell. Luke froze. He raised his hands slightly, palms facing outward, a subtle gesture he had used often in the military to show he meant no harm. The Mustang stood rigid for a moment, tail flicking at the twilight air. Up close, Luke could see a small cut on the horse's left hind leg. Dried blood caked around the wound. It seemed like an older injury, but possibly it still caused discomfort. He noticed how the Mustang held that leg differently, as though ready to shift weight if needed. This horse, Luke realized, wasn't purely wild. It bore subtle signs of past human care. The hair near its withers had a faint rub pattern, as though a saddle had once been there. Perhaps it had run away or been abandoned. In any case, a Mustang with a partial limp didn't last long in the wild, yet here it stood, proud and unbroken. When Luke took another step, the horse tossed its head and let out another neigh, stepping back. He paused again, but something about the situation urged him forward. He had learned in the Marines to read body language in high-stakes environments, and the signals he got from this Mustang were far from typical fear. It was watching him, evaluating him. Luke felt that somehow it wanted him to follow. The notion was absurd. No wild horse would do such a thing. Still, the desire to approach was too strong to ignore. "Easy," Luke murmured, voice low. He had no idea if the horse responded to speech, but the gentle tone sometimes calmed spooked animals. He edged forward again. This time, the Mustang jerked around and trotted deeper into the pines. Luke's breath caught, expecting it to vanish among the trees. But after covering some 20 or 30 yards, the horse stopped. It glanced over its shoulder, meeting Luke's eyes once more. Luke frowned. This was bizarre behavior. He patted his own horse, whispered, "Stay here," then tethered it loosely to a half-broken fence post, gathering a small flashlight from his jacket pocket. He set off in pursuit of the Mustang. Rationally, he told himself this wasn't smart. Sunset was closing in. The forest got dark quickly, but that flicker of curiosity was undeniable. He needed to know why this horse lingered rather than simply running off. The Mustang led him between towering pines, each trunk lit by golden rays of the dying sun. Dry needles crunched beneath Luke's boots, and the earthy scent of decaying leaves filled the air. The forest floor dipped into a gentle slope, and soon the tall grass gave way to undergrowth, small shrubs, ferns, and patches of brambles. Every so often, the horse would glance back. Luke continued, a sense of both excitement and apprehension growing in his chest. He had faced firefights in war zones, seen the aftermath of IED explosions, and lost comrades. Yet this felt like stepping onto an uncharted battlefield. No bullets or blasts, just the quiet tension of a wild horse guiding him. His heart pounded in a strangely similar way, adrenaline mingling with a sense of wonder. The Mustang maintained a pace that never outdistanced Luke completely, as though careful not to lose him. Eventually, the light began to fade. Luke flicked on his small flashlight, the beam dancing across tree trunks and patches of grass. The horse's coat gleamed in the flashlight's reflection whenever it flicked an ear or turned its head. Under normal circumstances, a truly wild Mustang would not permit a human to stay this close. But as Luke pressed on, he felt the forest grow thicker, the path narrower, until it seemed he was leaving all signs of the ranch far behind. His mind whispered questions he could not answer. Why am I doing this? Should I turn back? This is insane. Yet something deeper propelled him. Perhaps it was the loneliness that had gnawed at him since his father's death, or the restlessness in his heart that had refused to settle even after leaving the military. The Mustang felt like a call, a beckoning from fate or nature. He could not dismiss it as mere coincidence. The horse eventually halted, tossing its head toward a faint trail winding through the underbrush. Luke shone his flashlight, revealing a path he hadn't seen in years, maybe not since he was a small boy exploring with a sense of childish adventure. He remembered that once upon a time, there had been rumors of old homesteads out here, abandoned decades ago. Could that be where the Mustang was leading him? He clutched the flashlight tighter and took a deep breath. The notion that an injured horse might lead him anywhere with purpose was surreal. Yet each time he questioned it, the Mustang took another step, flicked its tail, and seemed to invite him onward. Luke had no reason to trust it, but no reason to distrust it either. Strange or not, the pull was irresistible. Luke followed the Mustang deeper into the pines as the last glow of daylight dissolved into dusk. Overhead, the canopy thickened, branches weaving together in a silent dance. A soft wind hissed, causing the tall evergreens to sway gently and cast moving shadows across the forest floor. Needles and leaves crunched beneath Luke's boots with each step, sounding louder than ever in the hush. From somewhere in the distance came the faint hoot of an owl, a reminder that night creatures were stirring. He glanced at the Mustang. He still hadn't named it, but in his mind, he was starting to call it Solace, a silent tribute to the sense of calm it brought him despite the bizarre situation. The horse would pause every few yards, turn its head as though ensuring he was still there, then continue on. Even with his flashlight, Luke struggled to see far. Sometimes the Mustang's shape flickered in and out of darkness. Yet each time, he managed to keep up, pushing through undergrowth and stepping carefully over exposed roots that curled like skeletal hands across the path. The trail was barely recognizable, more like a memory of a path than a maintained route. Once or twice, Luke stumbled on loose stones or sank ankle-deep in soggy patches. He realized this section of forest had been untouched for what could be decades. It felt primal, secretive, as if it guarded stories older than him or his father. Finally, after what felt like an hour, though it might have been less, he saw a break in the tree line ahead. The land dipped into a small hollow, and the shadows parted to reveal a clearing choked with tall weeds. At the center, illuminated by the pale beam of the flashlight, stood a cabin. It was little more than a sagging structure of wood, battered by time and neglect. The roofline slanted precariously, and ivy or moss clung to the logs like an invading army. Even from a distance, Luke could see that one side of the porch had collapsed, and the windows, if they still existed, must have been shattered or boarded up. The Mustang paused. Luke found himself stepping forward alone, transfixed by the sight. A broken sign near the door hung by a single nail, swinging gently in the breeze. The half-faded words read, "Whitmore Ranch, 1946. Luke recognized neither the name nor the date. He wasn't aware of any Whitmore families still living in Lone Ridge, which suggested this place had been abandoned a very long time ago. Solace, he might as well call it that, let out 3 sharp neighs, each echoing in the otherwise silent hollow. It was as if the horse was alerting whoever or whatever might be inside. The thought of anyone being there gave Luke a chill. He angled his flashlight at the cabin door, noticing it was fitted with a rusted metal lock, though that lock might have been worthless by now. The door itself was scarred, chipped, and looked as if a good shove could break it open. Despite the spookiness of the scene, Luke felt an odd compulsion to investigate. He told himself it was the Marine in him, the desire to secure an unknown area, to figure out if there was any immediate threat. But a deeper part of him sensed this was the reason the Mustang had led him here. An unsettled feeling passed through Luke, as though he were stepping into a place where old ghosts lingered. He walked closer, shining the flashlight along the cabin's exterior. The boards had warped over time, letting small gaps appear in the walls. From one such gap, an unpleasant odor wafted out, a mix of musty decay and something else he couldn't immediately identify. It made his stomach clench. Solas, standing a few paces behind him, stomped the ground with a front hoof and let out a snort, as if urging Luke to discover the cabin's secret. Luke pressed an ear to the door. Silence. No shuffle of movement. No rustle of an animal inside. Then he knelt down and examined the lock. It wasn't freshly damaged, it just looked old and corroded, possibly locked from the inside or jammed. A small wave of apprehension hit him. Why would the door be locked from within an abandoned house? And how had the Mustang come to know anything about it? He raised the flashlight to the dusty window next to the door, but grime coated the glass. He couldn't see more than a few vague shapes inside. The stench grew stronger here. It was reminiscent of rot, but not quite the smell of a dead animal. Perhaps mold, or stagnant water that had been trapped for years. Luke exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Part of him wanted to walk away, to assume it was just an old ruin with nothing of note. But the memory of that Mustang's wounded leg, its persistent beckoning, kept him rooted to the spot. Stepping back, Luke aimed the flashlight around the clearing. In the gloom, the thick underbrush seemed to crawl closer, as if guarding the cabin from prying eyes. The Mustang stayed put, eyeing him intently. "All right," Luke murmured, voice hushed. "Let's see what you're trying to show me." He set his shoulder against the door and pushed. At first, it gave only a creak. He tried again, throwing more weight into it, but the door remained wedged tight. If it was locked from the inside, it might need more force. Searching near the porch, he spotted a rotting 2x4. Testing its weight, he considered using it as a lever or pry bar. As he moved back to the door, a wave of dread pricked at his neck. The smell was powerful now, sour, damp, and vaguely chemical. When he pried at the door with the plank, the wood frame groaned. After several tries, the lock seemed to slip, and with a cracking sound, the door swung inward an inch or two. Luke shoved again, dislodging debris behind it. The Mustang let out a short, tense neigh, as though in anticipation. Luke paused, heart pounding. Why am I doing this? The question lingered, but he pressed his hand to the door and felt it move. A final effort forced the door open enough for Luke to slip inside. He swallowed, shining the flashlight around. The interior smelled far worse than outside, an oppressive staleness that stung his nostrils. He was in what looked like a front room. Broken furniture lay scattered, a table overturned, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling. The floor was coated with dust and a spongy layer of dampness. No sign of fresh footprints, no scurrying animals, but further in, A hallway stretched into darkness. Luke glanced over his shoulder at the Mustang outside. The horse remained by the threshold, not stepping in, as though respecting some boundary. Its eyes shone in the flashlight's reflection, encouraging Luke to continue. He called out, "Hello?" The only response was the faint echo of his voice through the corridor. The sense of foreboding grew stronger, yet he forced himself to move deeper, picking his way around a broken chair and what might have been a lampstand in better days. Luke carefully advanced along the cabin's main hallway. The flashlight's beam roved over peeling wallpaper and old photos in shattered frames. Each picture showed glimpses of a family long gone, a father with his arm around a young boy, a mother holding a baby, both children smiling in front of this very house when it must have been new. Luke felt a hollow ache at the sight of these frozen moments. Whatever had happened here, the place was now a decaying tomb of memories. As he reached a narrow doorway to the right, he smelled an even stronger odor, musty rot mingled with something bodily. His pulse quickened. The door was jammed or locked. When he turned the handle, it refused to budge. Luke pressed an ear to the door and thought he heard the faintest rustling within. Heart pounding, he stepped back. Searching around, he spied a broken table leg that could serve as a crude battering ram. He braced himself and slammed the wood against the door near the latch. It took several solid hits, but eventually the doorframe cracked. Luke shoved his shoulder against it, and it burst inward. A blast of foul air struck him, making him cough. He lifted the flashlight and saw a small, windowless room. Amid the darkness, a figure lay curled on the floor, like a discarded rag doll. Adrenaline flooded Luke as he realized it was a person, a woman. He rushed forward, mind racing with 100 questions. Was she alive? Why was she in here? Dropping to one knee, he aimed the flashlight at her face. She looked pale, lips chapped, skin glistening with sweat. Her clothes were torn and filthy, one shoe missing. Luke's training kicked in. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. Weak, but present. She was breathing in short, shallow bursts. "Hey," he called, voice echoing in the cramped space. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response beyond a faint moan. Her eyes fluttered but remained closed. Luke scanned the room quickly. There was no obvious bed or furniture aside from shattered boxes and moldy rags. The air felt suffocating. He checked her arms and legs for major wounds, found nothing aside from scrapes and bruises. Still, her condition looked dire, dehydration, perhaps starvation. He fumbled in his jacket for the small water bottle he always carried. Carefully, he lifted her head, letting a few drops trickle onto her lips. She made a small sound, almost a whimper, and tried to swallow. Encouraged, Luke let a bit more water drip into her mouth. The floor was damp from the cabin's leaking roof, adding to the smell of mildew. He had no idea how long she'd been in here, but from her state, it could have been days. With no windows, there was no cell service. Luke grabbed his phone anyway, hoping for a miracle, but it showed no bars. "Damn it," he muttered. He needed to get her outside. He slid one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and lifted. She was slight, yet dead weight from unconsciousness made carrying her awkward. Still, Luke was no stranger to hauling wounded comrades. He staggered back through the doorway, through the hallway, the flashlight wobbling as he tried to keep it steady. When he emerged into the front room, he caught a glimpse of the Mustang, still at the threshold. Peering in, its ears were pricked forward, eyes shining with urgency. Luke couldn't help but feel the horse was checking on them. "She's alive," Luke said softly, as if the Mustang could understand. Then, adjusting his grip, he managed to navigate through the splintered entrance. The woman's head lolled against his chest, her hair damp with sweat. Outside, the air felt like a blessing, cool and fresh compared to the stifling rot inside. Luke gently laid her on a patch of grass a few steps from the cabin. Solace moved closer, nostrils flaring. He let out a low, almost comforting snort, as though reassuring them both. Luke removed his jacket and laid it beneath her head, then pulled his phone out again, waving it around in the hope of catching a signal. Faintly, a single bar flickered. Swallowing hard, he punched in 911. At first, nothing, then a shaky connection. A dispatcher's voice crackled on the other end. Luke spoke hurriedly, giving his approximate location, explaining he'd found a woman, unconscious and in critical condition. He suspected dehydration, maybe shock. The dispatcher sounded concerned but said the location was remote. They'd send an ambulance and possibly a rescue team, but it might take time to navigate the unused trails. Luke ended the call, relief and anxiety warring within him. "We're getting you help," he murmured to the woman. He offered more water, letting it trickle between her lips. She managed a slight swallow, a faint moan. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a second, Luke thought she might wake, but she remained on the edge of consciousness. Minutes dragged on. The Mustang grazed around them in short circles, occasionally returning to stand watch. Luke checked the woman's pulse again. Still weak but not fading. He kept talking to her, even if she couldn't respond, telling her to hang on. Something about that cabin, the locked door, gnawed at him. Why had she been trapped there? Had she been locked in on purpose? The rancid odor in the room, he couldn't quite place it, but he forced those questions aside. The priority was saving her life. Finally, distant lights flickered among the trees, a mix of red and blue. The faint wail of a siren carried through the woods, growing louder. Luke exhaled, rising to wave them in. He was amazed they'd found a route this quickly. A paramedic truck and a police SUV rumbled up, headlights washing over the scene. Medics leapt out, kneeling beside the woman. One of them, a brunette with a calm but firm demeanor, checked her vitals. Her partner administered an IV line. Luke stepped back, letting the professionals work. A deputy approached, name badge reading Ramirez. He asked Luke a few clipped questions. "How'd you find her? Was there anyone else around?" Luke nodded at the Mustang. "That horse led me here." Ramirez eyed the animal skeptically, but he offered no argument. He scribbled notes, glancing between the cabin and the unconscious woman. The situation was clearly out of the ordinary. Within a few minutes, they had the woman on a stretcher, carrying her carefully toward the ambulance. A paramedic looked at Luke and asked, "Name?" Luke shook his head. "She had a necklace with Sage Whitmore on it, but that's all I know." Another paramedic flashed a quick thumbs up in acknowledgement. Then the ambulance door slammed shut. The siren kicked up, and the vehicle disappeared into the shadows of the forest, heading back toward the main road. In the aftermath, Luke stood there in the swirling dust and fading light. The Mustang approached him, pressing its nose gently against his arm. Ramirez gave Luke a pat on the shoulder. "Hell of a night." "Huh?" he said. "You did good." Luke managed a small nod, glancing at the old cabin's silhouette. He felt the weight of exhaustion settle over him. As the police wrapped up their initial inspection, they decided to secure the site for further investigation in daylight. "We'll come back tomorrow," Ramirez said. "Might be more clues inside. If you hadn't come along, or that horse hadn't found you," his voice trailed off. The unspoken conclusion was clear. Sage would likely have died alone in that dark room. Luke gave the Mustang another look, stroking the tangle of its mane. "I'm not sure if I found it or it found me," he said quietly. The horse exhaled warm breath against Luke's hand, and in that moment, it felt as though they understood each other in some primal, unspoken way. Eventually, the paramedics and deputies cleared out, leaving Luke alone under the quiet canopy of night. The only trace of the chaos was the cabin's broken door, and the echo of sirens still fading in the distance. Solace lingered by the porch. As though standing guard, Luke's mind whirled with questions about the woman, Sage Whitmore, and what had brought her to this forsaken place. Yet another pressing thought struck him. The horse. Now that the rescue was over, would it wander off into the night? But Solace stayed put, following Luke at a comfortable distance when he made his way back through the forest to retrieve his own horse. By the time Luke returned to the broken fence at the ranch's western boundary, the moon had risen high, illuminating the fields with pale silver. He led his ranch horse through the gap, not once hearing Solace's hoofbeats behind him. but somehow sensing the Mustang was there. When he glanced over his shoulder, the Mustang stared back, calm and watchful. In the silent darkness, Luke paused, hand resting on the fence post. "Guess we're both a little lost," he said softly. The Mustang flicked its ears. Then, under the wide Montana sky, man and horse walked side by side into the night, burdened by unanswered questions and bound by a strange, inexplicable connection. Luke Callahan guided his ranch horse slowly along the dark trail, the events of the night still whirling in his mind. The emergency responders had taken Sage Whitmore to the hospital, leaving him alone beneath the pale moonlight and tall pines. Yet, he wasn't truly alone. The wild Mustang, this strange, silent savior, kept pace a short distance behind, its hoofbeats muffled in the layers of fallen needles. Each time Luke glanced over his shoulder, the horse stared back, calm yet unwavering. When he finally reached the broken western fence of the Callahan ranch, Luke dismounted and led his horse through the gap. He expected the Mustang to vanish into the forest, free as it was. But when he turned, it stood just outside his property line. Even in the dim light, Luke could make out the slight dip of its left hind leg, that old injury still visible. "You can come in if you want," he murmured under his breath, only half believing the horse would understand. He latched the gate behind him anyway and trudged toward the barn, exhausted. By the time he glanced back again, the Mustang was nowhere to be seen, yet, in the morning's first light. As Luke stepped onto his creaking porch, he found the horse standing just beyond the outer fence, ears pricked forward. The early sun lit the Mustang's rugged coat, highlighting the tangles in its mane. It was as though it had chosen to wait for him, an unspoken invitation lingering between them. Luke felt a rush of gratitude and puzzlement. He had no idea why the Mustang kept hanging around. Had it been domesticated once and was seeking a new place to belong? Or was it simply curious? The line between wild and tamed seemed blurry with this animal. He spent the rest of the day tending to the few horses that remained from his father's old stock, hauling hay bales and filling water troughs. Every so often, he glanced toward the fence. The Mustang stayed within sight but maintained a cautious distance, flicking its tail and stepping away when Luke got too near. By late afternoon, Luke decided to encourage this silent companionship. He set a small pile of dried hay and a basin of fresh water near the fence. Then he backed off, giving the horse space. At first, the Mustang eyed him skeptically. Its nostrils flared, inhaling the unfamiliar scent. Minutes passed before it approached, muzzle dipping to sniff. Eventually, it accepted the hay, chewing with deliberate calm, though it never let Luke come closer than a few yards. Over the next several days, this pattern repeated. Each dawn, Luke found the Mustang, sometimes near the fence, sometimes grazing a short distance away. He took to calling it Solace in his head, a word that captured the strange comfort the horse had brought him in that terrifying moment at the cabin. Just thinking of the name eased some hidden tension in Luke's chest. Once Solace grew more comfortable, Luke began inching nearer. He would speak softly, letting the horse recognize his voice. Sometimes he'd say, "Easy there, Solace," or "Morning, friend," in the same gentle tone he used with newly broken colts. Each day, Solace allowed him a few steps closer, until at last Luke could extend a hand and brush the coarse mane or scratch lightly behind the ears. A spark of connection flared whenever he felt the warmth of the Mustang's skin. "You're a tough one," Luke whispered one cool evening, lingering by the fence as the sun dipped below the horizon. "What brought you here? Did you sense Sage was in danger? Or am I just reading too much into this?" Solace exhaled softly, as if in answer, then ambled back a few steps to resume grazing. The horse remained an enigma, but Luke found himself oddly reassured by its presence. After nearly a week of this gradual bonding, Luke decided to take Solace to Oak Hollow Veterinary Clinic. A limp still lingered in the horse's gait, and Luke wanted to be sure the wound hadn't worsened. It took patience and gentle coaxing to guide Solace into a borrowed trailer. Luke never forced it. Surprisingly, the Mustang allowed him to slip on a halter for the short trip into town. Dr. Eliza Monroe, a veterinarian who had known Luke's father well, greeted him with warm familiarity. She examined Solace with delicate precision, running her hands along the horse's legs and checking its teeth. Luke watched anxiously, arms folded. "No microchip?" Dr. Monroe said at last, shaking her head. "But there's definitely evidence of an old saddle rub. This horse was trained at some point. Maybe it escaped or was let go." She moved to Solace's rear leg, inspecting the scar. "The wound looks superficial now. You've been taking good care of it. Or it healed on its own. Either way, it's not serious." Luke patted the Mustang's neck, relieved. "Does that mean I can keep it? Or does it still belong to someone?" The veterinarian offered a slight smile. "You can put out a notice, ask around. But if nobody claims Solace, well, maybe it chose to come back because it found someone worth trusting." Luke's chest tightened at those words. Someone worth trusting. He liked the sound of that more than he cared to admit. Because in a strange way, the horse's quiet loyalty was healing something in him, some intangible wound deeper than flesh and bone. A few days later, Luke received a call from the Lone Ridge Hospital. The woman he had rescued, Sage Whitmore, had regained consciousness. They said she remembered fragments of her ordeal, and that she had asked about the man who found her. Luke felt his pulse quicken. Without hesitation, he told the nurse he would come by to see her. Early the next morning, Luke drove his old pickup truck into town. Lone Ridge's main street was modest, a handful of shops, a diner, and a small post office. The hospital was a single-story structure perched near the edge of town, overlooking miles of rolling pasture land. Inside, a nurse directed him down a short corridor to Sage's room. He stepped in, noticing how pale she was against the crisp white sheets. Her eyes, however, shone with alertness, startled at first, then relieved. A faint smile curved her lips. "You're the one who pulled me out of that cabin," she said, voice still raspy. "Luke. Callahan, right?" Luke nodded. "I'm glad to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she admitted. She shifted, wincing slightly. "But the doctors say I'll make a full recovery. My name is Sage Whitmore." He couldn't hide his curiosity. "Whitmore. Like the sign said Whitmore Ranch. Was that place yours?" A flicker of something passed across her face. "Grief? Perhaps. Or old resentment. It belonged to my grandparents once. A part of the old Whitmore property," she explained. "My father was raised there, but he left a long time ago. Things weren't peaceful in that household. A dispute tore the family apart." Her voice caught, and she paused before continuing. "They disowned him after some fight over inheritance. He tried to forget that place, but I suppose he never truly did." Luke drew closer to the bed, arms crossed gently. "I only saw it by chance, or maybe not chance. My horse, well, a wild Mustang, actually led me straight to that cabin." Sage's eyes widened. "A Mustang led you there?" She let out a soft laugh tinged with disbelief. "That's how I got out alive. I remember lying there in the dark, hardly able to move. Then I heard a horse's neigh outside. Soon after, you burst in." Luke's throat constricted at the memory. "I'm just relieved you made it. But what were you doing there in the first place?" She ran a hand through her hair, visibly grappling with how much to say. "Finally," she exhaled. "After my father died, I found hints, old letters, references to the Whitmore Ranch in Montana. It seemed my grandparents had cut him off over something that happened decades ago. He never spoke much about it, but I knew it haunted him." She glanced at Luke. "I wanted closure, so I drove here, hoping to find any documents left behind in that cabin. Maybe letters or diaries that could tell me why my dad was forced out, why he never returned." Luke recalled the battered state of the cabin. "Did you find anything?" She shook her head. "I barely had time. I opened a few drawers, and the wind slammed the door. It jammed somehow, or locked. There was no signal on my phone. I yelled until my voice gave out, but no one passed by. No neighbors in that part of the woods." Her expression turned somber. "I thought I would die in there." A silence settled over them. Luke's mind flashed back to that stifling darkness, the smell of mold, and the fear he felt seeing her barely clinging to life. Well, He finally said, voice quiet, "You're safe now. And those letters, do you still want to find them?" Sage's hands clenched the blanket. "I have to. This might be my last chance to piece together my family's story, to understand the secrets that drove them apart." He nodded slowly. "I get it. I lost my father recently, too. There's so much I never asked him. It's hard living with regrets." She studied him for a moment. "I'm sorry for your loss. If you're willing, maybe you could help me go back there, once I'm released, to see if we can find what I missed." A memory of the collapsed door flickered in Luke's mind. The place was dangerously unstable. Yet, he also recalled how the paramedics and police had left it with a note to investigate more thoroughly in daylight. "I'll help," he agreed. "I can even check it out ahead of time. Make sure it's safe, if you trust me with that." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Thank you. I do trust you, and evidently, that Mustang does, too." Luke's gaze drifted to the hospital window, imagining Solace back at the ranch, likely standing in the pasture. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's hard to explain, but it's like the horse knew someone needed help." Sage's eyes, though weary, held a glimmer of hope. "I'm grateful," she whispered. "To both of you." They talked a bit longer, Luke filling in details about how he'd found her, Sage explaining the few fragments of her father's life she was able to glean from scattered letters back home. Before he left, she asked for his phone number, promising to call him once she got word on her discharge. He scribbled it on a notepad for her, feeling an odd warmth in his chest as their fingers briefly touched. Outside in the hospital corridor, a nurse stopped him. "She's lucky you showed up when you did," she said quietly. "Another day, maybe even another hour. It could have ended differently." Luke lowered his eyes. "That's what I keep thinking about. But I guess we owe it all to the horse." The nurse smiled politely, unsure how to respond. Luke thanked her, then stepped out into the crisp Montana air. As he drove back, he mulled over Sage's story. Something about it tugged at him, perhaps a reflection of his own regrets about never fully understanding his father. Now, by a strange twist of fate, he might help Sage uncover a past she never knew. "Hang on. Old ranch," he muttered under his breath. "We're coming back." In his rearview mirror, the silhouette of Lone Ridge's hospital grew smaller, yet he felt that a bigger journey lay just ahead. 1 week passed before Luke judged it wise to venture back to the Whitmore cabin. Sage was still resting under the hospital's watch, but her strength improved daily, according to the quick phone calls they shared. She insisted she'd join him soon, but Luke was determined to scope out the place first, ensuring no further dangers lurked inside. The authorities had done a preliminary check but left most of it undisturbed. There was no clear sign of foul play beyond Sage's accident. Early on a brisk morning, he saddled his best ranch horse, then coaxed Solace to follow. The Mustang had grown comfortable around him, though it still maintained a certain independence. Luke had fashioned a simple halter for Solace, not quite willing to force a bridle or saddle on the horse just yet. To his relief, Solace seemed to accept this small concession. Together, they set out for the forest path leading to the abandoned cabin. The journey felt different this time. Luke wasn't stumbling through the dark, driven by some mysterious call. Instead, he led the way, with Solace trotting at his side. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines, revealing the undergrowth more clearly. Where Luke had previously seen only shadows, he now noticed subtle traces of old wagon ruts, a few half-buried fence posts that might have once marked the boundary of the Whitmore property. It struck him how history could vanish if left untended. When they finally arrived at the small clearing, the cabin looked just as forlorn as before. The porch sagged at one corner, and the door hung crooked on broken hinges, the handiwork of Luke's forced entry. Solace let out a cautious snort, perhaps remembering the last time they stood here. Luke dismounted his ranch horse, looped the reins over a low branch, and gave Solace a reassuring pat. "Stay close if you want," he murmured to the Mustang. "But watch your step." He pulled a flashlight, gloves, rope, and a basic first aid kit from his saddlebag. The memory of Sage lying half dead inside these walls made him tighten his jaw. He was determined not to let any more surprises catch him off guard. The first room was much as he'd left it. Scattered furniture, a thick film of dust, and the stale odor of mold. The gloom felt less menacing in daylight, though. Luke walked carefully, testing each plank of the floor before committing his weight. In the small side room where he'd found Sage, the air was still stale. A broken window near the ceiling let in a sliver of light. He propped it open to encourage some ventilation and paused, recalling how he'd carried her out, unsure if she'd survive. Pressing on, Luke discovered a narrow passage leading toward the back. It opened into a cramped space full of soggy boxes and rotted shelves. No sign of anything valuable or personal, just a few rusted tools and water-damaged newspapers. He nearly gave up when he noticed a faint gap along the ceiling in one corner. The beams overhead looked weakened by time, one sagging precariously. He shone his flashlight upward. The plaster was cracked, and the wooden boards above showed a small rectangular cutout. An attic hatch, maybe, but it was partially concealed by the remains of an old coat hung on a nail. A sense of purpose prickled through Luke. The outlines of a possible small loft or crawl space beckoned. Could this be where any letters were hidden? He found a wobbly stool that might help him climb, but it looked unreliable. Instead, he rigged a rope around a sturdy support beam, then carefully stood on a half-intact chair to reach the overhead hatch. The wood gave slightly under his weight. Dust rained down, making him cough. At last, he managed to push aside the old coat and pry open the hatch. It creaked, revealing a dark cubby that smelled of spiderwebs and age. Bits of insulation crumbled as he hoisted himself up. Inside, the space was tiny. Luke had to kneel, flashlight clenched between his teeth. His gloved hands groped around until he felt the edge of a wooden box shoved against the far side. He inched forward and dragged it back into the light. The box was covered in dust, and an old jacket partially wrapped around it. Beneath layers of grime, he could make out faint initials, T. He guessed it stood for Thomas Whitmore, Sage's father. Carefully, Luke pried the lid open. Inside lay a stack of envelopes tied together with thin twine. The paper yellowed with age. His pulse quickened. This had to be what Sage was seeking. The top envelope bore a date from the 1970s, addressed to mother and father. Another was from a law firm, referencing a will or contested inheritance. Shifting through them, he noticed a letter that had been torn in half, the words "I'm sorry" near the top. The meaning behind them might have been life-altering for the Whitmore family, but it was incomplete. He was certain Sage would want to read every single page. Satisfied he'd found what he came for, Luke tucked the box under one arm. Retracing his steps proved trickier. Balancing on the edge of the hatch, he gingerly lowered himself back into the main room. A swirl of dust danced in the sliver of daylight as he landed, the old floorboards emitting a disgruntled creak beneath his weight. Just as he turned to head outside, a sharp crack echoed. The floor gave out beneath him. Luke felt a jolt of terror as his leg plunged into open space. The rotting boards collapsed into some shallow pit or crawl space below. He tumbled forward, colliding with a beam and scraping his arm painfully. The box of letters flew from his grip, landing with a dull thud. For a moment, stars danced in his vision. His shoulder ached, and dust filled his mouth, making him cough. Outside, he heard Solace's sudden neigh. A hoof battered against the porch. Panting, Luke tried to pull himself free from the hole, but the boards pinned his foot at an awkward angle. He spat dust, muttering a curse. Come on. Then the cabin door rattled. It took Luke a second to realize it was the Mustang, likely hearing the commotion and trying to push inside. "I'm okay," he yelled, though it sounded unconvincing even to him. He managed to dislodge his foot enough to crawl backward onto sturdier floor. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Blood trickled from a scrape on his forearm. Solace let out another fierce neigh, this time accompanied by a solid thump on the door. The horse was either using its head or hooves to knock. Luke imagined the poor animal in the shadowy entryway, anxious to get in. "All right." "Easy," he panted, summoning his strength. He gave a few strong tugs on his leg and finally wrenched it free. The board splintered, leaving behind a shallow pit that might have once been used for storage or plumbing. Coughing, Luke staggered upright and retrieved the box of letters. He tested the next few steps with extreme caution, each board squeaking in protest. Eventually, he reached the front room. The door gave under a slight push, and a blast of fresh air greeted him. There stood Solace, half inside the porch, ears pinned forward, dark eyes fixed on Luke's battered figure. Luke exhaled a ragged laugh. "I'm fine." "Buddy," he said, voice shaky. "I appreciate the concern." The Mustang snorted, nostrils flaring. In that moment, Luke felt an enormous swell of gratitude for the horse's unwavering presence, and for fate, or chance, that had brought them together. Cradling the box of letters against his chest, Luke stepped onto solid ground. He sank onto the crumbling porch steps, heart still pounding. Solace approached, pressing a warm muzzle against his shoulder. "Thank you," Luke whispered, resting a hand on the Mustang's neck. "We did it." "Huh? Looks like we found what Sage needs." He took a moment to catch his breath, glancing back at the dilapidated cabin. Despite the lingering aura of sorrow, it held a piece of someone's history that might finally explain why the Whitmore family shattered. Luke thought of Sage, of how determined she was to understand her father's past. Soon enough, he'd give her these letters, and maybe, in unraveling the Whitmore's secrets, they might both find a sense of closure for their own unspoken grief. Steadying himself, Luke rose, still clutching the precious box. Solace watched with calm intensity, as if confirming that their mission was accomplished. Together, man and horse left the old cabin behind, forging a slow path back toward the ranch and a future still uncertain, but at least a little clearer than it had been before. Sage Whitmore stepped out of the hospital 2 weeks earlier than the doctors advised. Her determination outweighing medical caution, she still looked pale, with bruises faintly visible on her arms, but her spirit gleamed each time she spoke of continuing her father's unfinished story. When she mentioned her intention to remain in Lone Ridge for a while, Luke surprised her by offering a place to stay at the Callahan Ranch. "It's not fancy," he had said, shifting his weight like he wasn't sure it was a good idea. "But there's room, and no one's gonna bother us way out here." She'd hesitated at first. Years of independence had made her wary of imposing on anyone. Still, something about Luke's quiet sincerity disarmed her. She accepted, and within days, she was unpacking her few belongings in one of the old guest rooms. The ranch house was rustic, built of thick logs and filled with the lingering scent of dust and horses. Sage found it oddly comforting, despite the peeling wallpaper and squeaky floorboards. Each morning, she rose at dawn to help Luke feed the remaining ranch horses, gentle but anxious creatures that had gradually regained health since Luke's return. Together, they replaced rotted fence rails, mended broken gates, and cleared debris from the stables. Sage, raised in an urban apartment, discovered an unexpected calm in such manual labor, the rhythmic shoveling of old straw, the soft nickers of horses nudging for attention. By late afternoon, they'd sometimes sit on the porch steps, sipping cool water and watching sunlight spill across the high prairie. In the evenings, the two rarely spoke about anything deeply personal, at least not directly, but the companionship itself, the shared tasks, the unhurried meals, the comfortable silences, began weaving them into each other's lives. Perhaps they were both too weary, each nursing invisible wounds, to put up walls, and so the walls stayed down, allowing something gentle and genuine to grow between them. Despite the outward tranquility of the ranch, shadows of the past still moved just beneath the surface. Luke sometimes paused mid-task, eyes losing focus as if seized by a memory. Sage would see that distant stare and recognize it as the same one she'd worn after her father's funeral. Grief, regret, and a measure of longing too deep to voice. They didn't pry into each other's nightmares. Instead, they offered small gestures of empathy. One afternoon, as they raked scattered hay in the stable, Sage softly asked, "Have you ever felt like you don't belong anywhere?" She didn't elaborate, and Luke merely looked at her, gave the briefest nod, and turned back to the task. That single gesture, however, conveyed volumes. He understood. A few evenings later, Sage brewed coffee in the ranch's modest kitchen. Luke wandered in, drawn by the aroma, she ventured. My dad left Lone Ridge decades ago. He rarely talked about it. My mom used to say he was haunted. I never knew by what. Then, when I tried to find answers, it led me to that cabin and nearly killed me. She let out a soft laugh devoid of mirth. Luke set down his mug, listening in silence. He recalled his own father, stoic Everett Callahan, who had died with so many words unspoken. I know the feeling, he managed. My old man passed before I could square things with him. I guess we each carry regrets. Doesn't always make sense. Does it? She studied his face, seeing the same mixture of sorrow and resolve that lay within herself. In that moment, she realized that she and Luke, for all their differences in upbringing, were bound by this shared ache. Each had lost a parent without understanding who they truly were. And they both yearned for answers not from the dead, but from the place and legacy that shaped them. They avoided speaking at length about Luke's military service, but sometimes in the middle of the night, she'd hear him gasping awake from nightmares. She never intruded, though just laid in her own bed, heart constricting. In the morning, she'd bring coffee to the porch without a word. He'd accept it, eyes tired. Grateful, day by day, they developed a rhythm of quiet support, letting the unspoken fill in the cracks. In that supportive silence, their bond deepened. They began to recognize the subtleties in each other's moods, offering presence more than conversation. Where others might have found awkwardness, they found solace. Solace, the wild Mustang turned guardian, quickly became part of this growing household harmony. No longer content to loiter by the fence, the horse began roaming the yard freely. At night, Luke sometimes found solace standing near the porch, head raised as though keeping watch. Other times, the Mustang drifted close to Sage's window, peering in as if to ensure she still breathed. By day, solace shadowed Sage on her short walks through the pasture. She enjoyed picking wildflowers, studying the changes in the sky, scribbling down notes in a small spiral-bound journal, remnants of her father's stories, or her own fledgling attempts to piece together the Whitmore lineage. Whenever she paused, Solace would stand a short distance away, tail swishing at flies, a calm sentinel in a world still uncertain. Late one evening, Sage woke to a faint neigh outside her door. Heart pounding, she crept into the hallway to see Solace stationed at Luke's room, ears pricked forward. She heard Luke stir, muttering in his sleep, a trapped sound, like a man reliving horror. Sage moved to the threshold, prepared to knock. But the moment her hand lifted, Luke's breathing shifted, calming as if the presence of horse and friend had chased away the dark dream. This Mustang, she thought, odd, is more intuitive than most humans. And so Solace became a bridge, wordless, patient, always attuned. In some ways, the horse offered what neither Luke nor Sage could articulate, a sense of unwavering acceptance that gently nursed their wounded spirits. One crisp autumn night, when frost sparkled on the windows, Luke and Sage built a small fire in the yard. They sat on overturned crates, feeding logs to the flames. Solace stood off to one side, amber light reflecting in its eyes. Luke gazed at the dancing embers. "I never thought I'd want to see 40, he murmured. Back in the desert, some nights, I was so sure I wouldn't make it home. His voice broke softly, but maybe I was wrong. Sage's eyes glistened. She reached out a hand toward his arm but stopped just shy of touching. Maybe the Mustang knows better than we do, she teased gently, though tears shone in her smile. Solace emitted a quiet snort, stepping a bit closer. The warmth of the fire licked at the darkness around them, casting gentle shadows on the barn walls. In that hush, they felt a fragile yet profound spark of hope, an unspoken vow that although the past had hurt them, perhaps the future might redeem what they'd lost. Winter's first breath chilled Lone Ridge, veiling the fields in morning fog and leaving a thin crust of ice on the water troughs. One such morning, Sage insisted Luke accompany her back to the Whitmore cabin. She stood before the sagging structure, observing how frosted dew glistened on the crooked steps. The place reeked of old tragedy, a place where she nearly died, and where her family's secrets had lain hidden for decades. "I want to fix this," she said quietly, hugging her arms for warmth. "I don't want it to remain the spot where I almost lost my life. I need it to be something worth remembering." Luke understood. He could see how her gaze lingered on the cabin's battered framework, envisioning possibilities beyond the decay. She explained that she still had a bit of inheritance money. With some planning, she could shore up the structure, replace the roof, and perhaps restore it to a usable state. "Why hold on to a nightmare?" Luke asked. Not unkindly. "Because," she replied, eyes unwavering, "it's part of my family story. If I leave it in ruins, then all that pain accomplishes nothing. I'd rather transform it into a place of belonging, a place to show that we can reclaim what was broken." They discussed it briefly that same afternoon, walking around the property to note which timbers were salvageable and which needed replacing. Sage was surprised when Luke abruptly bent down, picked up a loose board, and began yanking out the rusty nails. He tossed them into a bucket with a dull clang. "What are you doing?" she asked. He shrugged. "We can't rebuild if we don't clear the rotten parts first. Might as well start now." She smiled, eyes brimming with gratitude. "Aren't you worried you'll waste time on something that isn't really yours?" Luke stared at the moldy plank in his hand, exhaling. "I don't see it as a waste. Working on this place feels like shedding an old skin, like I'm letting go of something that's weighed me down." He let the plank drop. "If it helps you too, then no time is wasted." Without further talk, they got to work. In the following days, the two systematically tore out crumbling boards, carted away debris, and propped up sections of the frame. With each noisy bang of a hammer or shriek of a saw, Luke felt some internal tension easing. He sensed Sage felt it too. Every measured swing was like a symbolic blow against the ghosts that haunted them both. Naturally, Solace insisted on being present each day. At first, the Mustang simply loitered in the yard, tail flicking, watching them lug wooden beams and plywood around. Occasionally, it wandered up to sniff a coil of rope or investigate an open paint bucket. Sage teased Luke that they needed to keep an eye on Solace so it wouldn't end up with a green nose. Sometimes, children from the edge of town passed by on their way to explore the forest. They stopped in awe at the sight of the magic horse that had rescued a woman in the woods. The kids would stand at a respectful distance, whispering conspiratorially. Solace soaked in the attention, ears perked as though listening to every rumor. "Look at that," Sage remarked with a grin, pausing from her hammering. "Solace is more famous than either of us. We're basically a footnote in its legend." Luke snorted. "Let's hope the horse doesn't demand special treatment." Yet truthfully, they both delighted in the small pockets of wonder that Solace brought into their day. Whether it was calmly supervising their chores or letting a curious child stroke its mane, the Mustang exuded a quiet dignity that turned every laborious moment into something almost joyful. In Lone Ridge, gossip spread faster than a wildfire in a summer drought. It didn't take long for Clara's Corner, the cozy cafe on Main Street, to become the epicenter of the story about the veteran and his mystical horse. Whenever Luke went in to grab coffee beans or Sage popped by to buy groceries, they'd endure friendly interrogation. Clara herself, an older woman with a permanent twinkle in her eye, regaled customers with the tale of how Luke and Solace saved Sage from certain death in the haunted Whitmore cabin. "I'm telling you," she'd say, voice hushed for dramatic effect. That horse showed up out of nowhere, led him straight to the locked room. If that's not fate, I don't know what is. The listening patrons would gasp or nod sagely, enthralled by the notion of a near-mythical Mustang guiding a soldier and saving a stranded woman. Luke normally disliked attention, but seeing the positivity that bloomed around their story softened his stance. He'd nod politely, letting people pat him on the back and say how grateful they were that someone like him had come home. More than once, a man in a cowboy hat or an elderly lady would buy him coffee or offer a handshake. The same reserved, Occasionally cynical neighbors who once looked at him with suspicion now greeted him with warmth. A group of elementary school students decided to write a mural for their classroom bulletin board. Solace, the horse that leads people to safety. Sage got wind of it one day and couldn't stop laughing. We should collect these stories. We'll have a small library corner in the cabin once it's done. Luke smiled at the thought. You really think people will come visit? They might, she said, turning serious. And maybe that's good. Let them see how something broken can be rebuilt. She paused. Let them see that we're still here, surviving and trying to make sense of it all. In this way, the modest town of Lone Ridge found a glimmer of hope in a time overshadowed by grim news headlines. For Luke, the experience was humbling. Each day, he felt a tiny piece of himself heal, and each day, he caught glimpses of Sage's determination blooming, her eyes reflecting a fresh courage he suspected she never knew she had. After weeks of labor in the cold, the Whitmore cabin underwent a transformation. The rotted roof was replaced with sturdy planks of local pine, the walls reinforced with fresh beams. They retained key sections of the original structure, like the thick wooden pillars in the main living space, to preserve its historic bones. Inside, Sage chose simple furnishings that reflected her father's taste for practicality. A rough-hewn wooden table stood in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs salvaged from antique shops. A small bookshelf adorned one wall, home to battered volumes that once belonged to Thomas Whitmore. On the opposite wall, an old trunk held the letters they'd recovered, the very ones that had prompted Sage's journey. I'm calling it Whitmore's Haven, Sage declared. She hammered a small sign above the front door, the words lovingly carved into a smooth plank. This is where memories come to rest, and maybe get a second chance. Luke admired the sign's simplicity. Whitmore's Haven? He echoed, placing a hand against the doorframe. He couldn't help thinking how far they'd come, from the night he'd broken in to save Sage. Even the intangible weight of the cabin's history felt different now, like a promise instead of a curse. The day of the cabin's unofficial grand opening dawned with a brilliant winter sun. Sage had invited a handful of neighbors, Dr. Monroe from the vet clinic, and of course Clara from the cafe. A few curious townspeople who'd heard the story of her rescue showed up. 2, each bearing small gifts like homemade pies or potted succulents. Luke wore a simple blue button-down shirt, feeling a bit uneasy as people milled around with wide-eyed admiration for the restored cabin. Solace was brushed to a gleaming sheen, left unbridled so it could wander at will. Children squealed in excitement whenever the Mustang walked by, reaching out hesitant hands to pet its muzzle. At one point, Sage gathered everyone in the main room, clearing her throat to address them. She held a sheet of paper, a letter from her father. The hush that fell over the gathering was profound, as though the ghosts of the past pressed in to listen. There was a time, she read, voice trembling slightly, when I believed I had to leave for the sake of my family's peace, but leaving never meant I didn't love them. I only hoped they could understand my silence was born of fear. Tears glistened in her eyes as she continued, the heartfelt words bridging decades of estrangement. By the time she finished, no one spoke. Then a ripple of gentle applause moved through the group, and with it, a sense of unity, like they had witnessed a small miracle within those walls. As dusk settled, people drifted off, saying their goodbyes and offering heartfelt congratulations. Clara insisted Sage accept a basket of muffins, wagging a finger if she dared refuse. Dr. Monroe gave Luke a friendly hug, whispering that Solace had found a good home indeed. When the last guest departed, only Luke, Sage, and Solace remained. The three stood on the newly built porch, gazing out at the rolling fields, where the sky burned with oranges and pinks. A gentle breeze stirred Solace's mane, prompting the horse to press closer to Sage, as though it, too, reveled in the afterglow of celebration. Luke exhaled, a deep sigh that carried months, perhaps years of tension. Feels like we've come a long way, he said, from a half-abandoned ranch to this. Sage rested a hand on Solace's neck. We did, she agreed softly, eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. Maybe we had to leave parts of ourselves behind to find where we truly belong. The wind rustled the grass, and for a moment, all that existed was the hush of early evening, the three of them bound by an unspoken triumph. In that radiant hush, the battered past could finally rest, while a hopeful future gently unfurled. In the weeks following the cabin's completion, life settled into a gentler pattern. Luke found himself drawn to an old notebook he discovered among his father's things. Its pages were mostly blank, but tucked inside were a few scribbled notes about the ranch, breeding schedules, feed expenses, and short journal entries. He decided to continue writing in it, not about finances or chores, but about Everett Callahan himself. Each evening, Luke jotted down a memory, a fishing trip with his dad when he was 10. The time they'd both laughed uncontrollably at a horse that kept sneaking apples. The last silent dinner they shared before he enlisted. Layer by layer, he began painting a portrait of the man he once viewed as distant. It was, in its own way, an act of reconciliation. Meanwhile, Sage immersed herself in the Whitmore letters, meticulously copying them into a spiral-bound journal. She added her own reflections, piecing together the familial rifts that drove her father away from Lone Ridge. Occasionally, she'd let out a soft sigh when she stumbled upon a particularly painful line, but she pushed forward. "I'm not writing this for the world to read," she told Luke. "Just for me to remember I tried, and I never gave up on him. Even if he gave up on this place." Luke understood completely. Amid the quiet glow of lamplight in the evenings, the two of them would work side by side, sometimes exchanging a few words, sometimes just enjoying the comfort of shared silence. Outside the windows, the hush of Montana nights wrapped around the house like a gentle embrace. Despite the open gates, Solace refused to vanish. The Mustang spent many days roaming the fields, occasionally disappearing for hours at a time. At dusk, the horse would trot back, neigh softly by the porch, as if announcing its return. It bore no halter or tether, and Luke made no attempt to confine it. Some animals, he realized, were meant to remain partially wild. In quiet moments, he'd watch Solace graze in the last rays of daylight, that proud head lifting whenever Luke came near. They'd share a wordless exchange of trust. The horse, though unclaimed by any brand, had chosen this ranch, these people. It belonged not by ownership, but by the bond forged during that fateful night in the woods. Sage often joked, "We should give it a title, Master of the Homestead." And Luke would reply, "Solace doesn't need a title. It's free, just like it should be." There was something poetic in the way the Mustang bridged independence with devotion, a lesson in loyalty that neither Luke nor Sage took for granted. Over time, Luke and Sage decided to open Whitmore's Haven to curious visitors who wished to read old letters, learn local history, or simply find a quiet place to think. They hosted small gatherings where children from town could sketch pictures of Solace, adding colorful scribbles to the cabin's newly minted art wall. More than once, a wide-eyed kid asked, "Is that horse magic?" Sage never gave a definitive answer, but her smile spoke volumes. One mild afternoon, as the two of them walked back from a local hardware store, Luke asked, "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if Solace hadn't shown up that night?" Sage looked at him, then reached out to gently grasp his hand. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it, because it did happen. And here we are." She gave his hand a soft squeeze, eyes bright with a gratitude that extended beyond words. "Maybe we would have stumbled around, lost and broken, never meeting at all." Luke's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the plains met the endless Montana sky. "I guess we owe that horse our lives." "We owe each other our lives," Sage corrected softly. "Solace was the link, but we did the rest." They walked on, the wind ruffling the grass around them in a gentle hush, the cabin at their backs, and the path ahead open and full of promise. Life, once fractured by war and family secrets, now beckoned with unspoken hope, a hope nurtured by a bond of three souls: a soldier, a woman rediscovering her roots, and a horse that refused to be contained. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.